Well, not to be corny or anything, but I've always felt you must cultivate your gardens, which is a Voltaire aid reference, that you always have to keep growing and, sort of learning. And that's the garden part, right? So sowing those seeds, making sure that you're growing, making those, cultivate your garden beds. And, so for now, today's marketer it's AI. You have to learn about AI and how you can actually use it to do your job.
Step into the world of success with Your Brand Amplified, the ultimate podcast designed to unravel the intricacies of thriving businesses. I'm your host, Annika Jackson, and I'm on a mission to uncover the stories, strategies, and secrets that have propelled entrepreneurs and business leaders to success. I am so happy to have Marc Viale here. Marc, you've been so patient with me as I'm making the transition suddenly out of necessity from Zoom to Riverside. And I'm really thrilled to have you here. You have had an extensive career in growth marketing, demand performance, revenue, any of those words, adjectives that you want to use when it comes to different sides of marketing. I've been primarily on the organic side. So diving into this conversation is going to be really great for the audience and for myself as well. And I wanted to start with thanking you for growing The Real Real, because I remember my daughter's now 17. When she was an infant, The Real Real was a go-to for me, and for all of the years, leading into her childhood, where I knew I could come and trust the brands I was looking at, trust the deals I was going to get, and know that they were authentic and that they were well picked and chosen. So thank you for being here, and let's dive right in.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you got into the marketing space. Were you always interested in learning how brands tick and what worked to grow their audiences?
Yeah, I sort of had a abnormal entry into marketing. So I've been in marketing for over 30 years, and I moved to Silicon Valley after college in the 90s. And it was just like an opportunistic time to move into Silicon Valley in the 90s because there's the whole .com boom. And I got into marketing. I had a history degree in college, and I just loved following trends of how countries, would evolve and decline. And I started seeing that with, lots of businesses and like understanding how people perceive them and all this kind of things. And so I very much got into I was always into how people perceive brands, and that sort of gave me my interest. And, I always tell, I talk to graduates of where I went to Marquette, and I always tell them, don't, worry about the degree you're following in undergrad. It's more important to learn how to learn. And I think that's sort of been my big thing, is I've always been pretty good at like picking up stuff and pivoting and, being able to learn on the fly. And yeah, The Real Real was one of those perfect examples of, it was after the 0809 equity crisis, and I just wanted to find something new and exciting.
Yeah. Well, what were the positions that you took before you got to Real Real? And then how did your career grow within The Real Real?
Yeah. So, I was in the very beginning, my marketing career started in an advertising agency, and I just went in there and I had some database background because I was working at a direct mail print shop. And so we were working with, house files and all that kind of thing back in the day, doing letter shop. And I went into a advertising agency in San Francisco and helped them with their clients there. And this was around the late 90s. And I was like, okay, I need to get into a .com. And so my first entry was ophoto.com, which was a picture sharing site, much like Shutterfly. They were the leader back then. We got acquired by Kodak when the .com boom started to fall apart. And that was sort of saved the company, but then also all the dinosaur DNA traits of Kodak started to infiltrate photo, and it started to slow down, right? And, from there, I went to this is right after the .com crisis. And so there was not a lot of startups happening, but I went into an established retailer, which was BB, women's retailer. And, BB was like the thing back then. It had a public IPO back when I started. And I helped them with database marketing, doing loyalty programs. And I sort of helped them get their .com piece going. And, leap forward today, I think their stores are all gone, but they still have their .com presence. And then, after that, sort of, I was like, I wanted to get back to startups. It's sort of I love working for startups because you sort of, I often tell people it's two different types of people. Some people like more process and they should go work, for a more established company. Some people like to build process and sort of create, and that's the startup type person. And so I wanted to get out of the established companies and would go back to a startup. I played around with some .coms, but I eventually landed at Second Life, which was the largest virtual world marketplace back in 2009. And they were, trading, buying and selling virtual goods, virtual land. It still exists today. It's sort of amazing. I think it's over $1 billion in-world economy, sort of this bizarre thing. And we could spend hours talking about those stories. But, it was in August of 2012, I got, the former CEO of Second Life left Second Life, and he knew Julie Wainwright at The Real Real. And, Julie was looking for a marketer, a digital marketer to sort of jumpstart her biz. And Julie, you may have heard of her before, The Real Real. She started up pets.com back in the .com boom. And that was largely successful until, the .com thing got hard. And she started up this weird, like, luxury clothing business, and I'm like, this has no chance. This is eBay. And so Mark said, you should talk to her. Just go talk to her. And so I went out to Sausalito, where they had this, like, it's right near the Sausalito boat area. It's just like right on the docks there. And, it's funny because we had all this luxury clothing in this garage warehouse, and it would often flood. It would come close to our building, and we were always scared it can't come closer. And investors would have to park in our parking lot and trudge through the water. It was sort of funny. But anyway, I went into this warehouse out in Sausalito to meet Julie, and, she painted this amazing picture of, like, you're sitting in a garage, and it's not this great thing. But, when you're talking to a CEO and they paint this vision that we're better than everybody else and this is going to be huge, and you're like, yeah, but can you pay me enough? And that's all you're thinking about. And, I always tell people, don't worry about how much you get paid, because if there's a vision and the CEO really feels strongly about it and then you feel good about it, you always got to think about the opportunity. And Julie's like, we probably can't match your current salary, but this is such a big opportunity. This is going to be bigger than, it's going to be like eBay, And, she was telling me, like, I was saying, it's just like eBay. How are you going to compete? And she's like, no. eBay doesn't deal with luxury consignment. They deal with everything. They don't have a niche, like, and nothing's authenticated. It's buyer beware. And so, like, and it's so much work to consign, to actually put your items up there. You have to deal with customer service issues. You have to have great pictures. And she says, we're solving all that. The big thing here is to really help the consigner, the seller. It's not about the buyer as much, because the buyer will love these luxury goods, but we really have to take the work off the consigner. And we have this white glove team that's going to go out to their homes and create these relationships to unlock this inventory. Because the people that have this inventory, these luxury goods, she explained to me, they don't need money. They just like money. And, like, so, they want to buy next season. And so they want to empty out their closet of old seasons and get money to go buy new. And, if you make it hard for them to do that, the biggest competitor for them is inertia. It's just not doing anything. They're not going to put it on eBay because that's too much work. And it really started to touch it. I was like, you're right. This is a really good example. And she's like, kept on saying, we're going to take the low end of Sotheby's and Christie's, and the high end of eBay, and we're going to take that market. And I was like, wow, I'm sold. And so, it took me a while. I was still a little bit, she seems a little wacky. But, it really started to, once I got going and the business started to open my eyes to it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's really amazing, because what came after The Real were so many other businesses that tried to duplicate what you were doing, tried to bring that customer service, authenticating the items. I did things many, many years after that with a company called Union and Fifth, which was somewhat similar concept, right? Designer resale, but you gave the money to charity, right? So we would go in, I had the Houston market. So we'd go in, interview the women to try to create a little mini series, and we would go through some of their clothes that they were donating, find out what charity they wanted to partner with. But quite frankly, it didn't work, and that they closed their doors. So, you were at the start of something really special, and the fact that you were able to see the vision that Julie had and then take it to the next level. I'd love to hear a little bit about how you did that.
So I was the first marketing employee, and, so we really had to, start from scratch, and we had probably like less than 20 people, opening for us. So it was mostly operations. And then, we had Rati, who had Rati's the present CEO of The Real. She had a really good eye for trends. She had a small business for doing merch, selling women's apparel in San Francisco. And she had a really good eye and vision for what's trending. And still today, it's sort of amazing, right? And, my job was like, how do we build this base, but also how do we get consigners, And so we had to get leads for people to sell. We had to get buyers. And, we talked a little bit about how we had to make it easier for the consigner. The other piece that nobody was looking at, everybody just said people would not care that things were authenticated or not. And actually, that was like the biggest value proposition we had, authentication. Now eBay's trying to catch up and say, oh, we authenticate now. And nobody got that, so there was lots of players like Poshmark got all into like social selling. This is great because you'll be able to make friends while you sell. But if it's fake, it's fake. And that was a big problem, right? And so we really spent a lot of time. First, we started out in women's and men's apparel. And so we had to get people from the fashion industry that were sort of aware of that. And that involved handbags. And so, we brought in some really good people that understood handbags, all the provenance of the handbags. Like, how do you know the history of them and what codes to look for authentication? And that became marketing for us, which was amazing. So I talked to a lot of people about what's your content strategy, and people just say, oh, we just put out stuff, what people like. And I really spend a lot of time now in my present company, Lab 415, helping companies to really focus on what are the key value propositions and do they align with growth? And what I mean by that, authentication was, people were very interested in how do we authenticate Louis Vuitton, right? And that there's huge search volume on how to do that. And of course, Louis Vuitton has probably 2 million searches a month. And we started doing these YouTube videos with, Graham, our handbag expert. And, we bought him this nice leather apron to wear. So, just give him this official flair. And we had an intern come in who had a background in social, and she started doing all these videos for us. And they were huge. We had this Louis Vuitton video that was ranked higher than any Louis Vuitton video. And that became aligned with our growth strategy, right? Because we're getting this organic buzz from our YouTube videos. And Graham was sort of this personality in itself. And that really helped us. So the buyer was really into the brands, right? It's for us, the beauty of The Real is we leverage the branding of the existing brands. So, it's not resale, it's Chanel. It's not resale, it's Louis Vuitton, Gucci. And so people really love that. And guess what? It's up to 90% off. And, in some cases, not that high, but up to 90% off. and we're authenticated. So it's no more eBay buyer beware. And we have these amazing brands, and so lots of companies today, I think, have a hard time. They think, oh, AI will save our profits and we'll get growth of AI. And you can only take that so far. Like you really need to have the good products. People at the end of the day, you have to have good products. And, I look at so many of these models, rental, all these things, unless they have good product, it's game over. And so that was, and the Real had, since we had this white glove team going into people's homes, creating relationships, sort of pacifying their fears about letting go of their luxury goods and being able to sell them. And we had to sell them fast. So we had to get buyers in. And we started really getting buyers of this authentication stuff. And then you have to balance getting more product. And so it's a balancing act in the beginning. So you can't have too many buyers and too little product and vice versa. And so that was a really, we couldn't grow as fast as we want. So we're like, oh, shoot, we need more product. And investors would be like, why can't you just spend $1 million a month? And like, well, if we don't have Louis Vuitton and Chanel, it's going to be the conversion will go down. And so we always had to do that convincing act. The other thing is, Julie, Rati, and I, and we brought in some good tech folks as well. And, I brought in a guy from Second Life to be our CTO. He was amazing, Frederick Bjork. And we had to always convince investors that people, like, we're dealing with lots of male investors. And so they didn't realize that women would buy resale. They're like, my wife would never buy that. And Julie would be like, oh, let me just go look in her closet and I'll tell you what she's bought. And that was a hard thing for us. And so we actually had to bring on a lot of women venture capitalists to help us in the very beginning to get started, because all the venture capitalists were looking at the platforms. And so they wanted a platform that was built out. And we're like, no, this is about building. We want the business model. So we want to have these sellers and these buyers, and we want to get awareness out there. And we'll figure out the platform, the technical part of it later. And that's a big thing, because there was a lot of companies when we got started, they were really good on building out the technical part of it, but they didn't have a value prop. They didn't have awareness. They didn't have sticky customers, because they just didn't have, people coming back. That's what I mean by sticky. And they failed. And there was a whole bunch of them, because there was the whole guilt thing going on. And so there was a company that came out of guilt called Vont. I think it was called Vont. And they were very popular in the press because, guilt was so good at press. And Vont was really good at getting celebrities' closets. But guess what? People didn't care that it came out of some celebrity's closet. They just cared if it was Chanel, And so, later on, we started playing with celebrity a little bit just to get some PR, but it wasn't critical for building the business. Really, it was about working on our value propositions of 1, the authentication, 2, service, that white glove service to a consignor, 3, explaining the luxury resale and how certain brands have better resale than other brands. And so that should make you a smarter buyer when you go into Neiman Marcus and Saks. And that was one of, just talking about those retailers. We were really smart and identifying our customer, because we basically put our white glove sales team into every market where there was a Neiman Marcus or Saks. And this is before Neiman Marcus and Saks were starting to have their problems. And so we're like, okay, let's go where the customers are, where they're buying at the primary market, Neiman Marcus and Saks and Nordstrom's. And we will have a bigger presence there. So New York and LA were really huge for us. And, we would actually, our big breakthrough moment was when we had a partnership with Neiman Marcus. And I think that was it was 2014, 2015. And that sort of gave us the credibility, oh, Neiman Marcus wants to work with us. And I think we worked with them maybe 6 months. And then one of their brands was like, you can't work at them. Some big handbag brand in France was like, you can't work with them. And same thing, we had a deal with Saks that followed, but we were knighted by these companies that we were the official. We're not eBay. It's not buyer beware, and that really launched us through. And then, as a marketer, we were spending a lot of time, and I think a lot of marketers do this because it's easy. We were spending a lot of time on digital and like Google, doing paid shopping, doing SEM, doing Facebook back then and Instagram. And those are good. And, those are your bread and butter. They'll always be your bread and butter. But the thing that I think a lot of marketers miss, in addition to organic, which you talked about, they miss the top of funnel. And what I mean by the top of funnel is it's TV, podcasts, radio, influencers, where you get introduced to a brand where you're not expecting it, And so with Google, you're really not growing the market. You're just getting the existing market. So people searching for luxury consignment or Chanel handbags, and you're not growing the market. And so you're fighting for that. And so you can spend and you grow, but eventually it's a small 5% return, right? And you're just like, because you're competing with everybody for the same market. You have to expand the market. And that was, I think, a big thing that a lot of companies don't realize. They have to expand the market. And there's companies that did this, right? So Uber and transportation did it. Because, taxi cabs had the apps and all that good stuff, but they weren't growing. They weren't expanding the market. Uber expanded the market because they did the black car service and everybody wanted to do that, right? And then Airbnb did the same thing. They expanded hospitality bigger than it was at this hotel level. Now, like everybody was renting their homes and like luxury vacation homes, and they expanded the hospitality industry. We wanted to do the same thing for luxury consignment. We had to expand it bigger than the small group of insiders that were fighting for. We did that around 2016, 2017. We started going into TV and Sue TV or like Pulu and things like that. And that really, you started to bring the idea into people's homes that weren't even thinking about it, but the value propositions that we had was solid, right? So authentication, save up to 90%, and then the brands, right? And that was just we always went with the set. A lot of people are like, why didn't you just bring in consigners? Why don't you do, since your biggest thing is to get more product, why don't you do messaging for consigners? And we found over and over that the buyer thing resonated, right? Because the buyer message, because everybody likes to buy. Consignment feels like work. And so our big thing is get these folks in and then we'll evolve them to sellers, And for the buyer message always had better performance and efficiency. And we really did that big on TV. Eventually the majority of our spend was on TV. And then, podcasts started to come into vogue in 2018, 2019, and we were going deep in there. And then the pandemic hit, and all this stuff changed. We rode some of the pandemic with top of funnel, but I really stress to a lot of marketers that you have to have a full funnel. In other words, you have to have your top of funnel, your middle funnel, which is your paid social, where you're engaging your customers. And then your bottom of funnel is people that are close to purchase, which is Google, right? So they're ready to buy. And the only way you grow is if you do that well, right? And for companies that are in growth stage, they really need top of funnel because they need to expand the market. And then, just circling back to organic, because I think that organic is something that a lot of marketers don't understand. They feel like it's technical and hard, and it's not. It's really interesting. And as you get lazy when you have all this budget and you just spend to grow. But one big thing that we did at The Real, our bread and butter, every company has a bread and butter organic play. And for us, it was our brands. So that Louis Vuitton page, that Chanel, Gucci page, that has so much ammo there for organic search. And then, of course, how do you expand that out beyond search? We want to start it's not just search and Google anymore. It's ChatGPT, right? And so like the good news for all content marketing folks is that ChatGPT sort of follows the same mechanisms as Google search. And so, when you go into ChatGPT and you do like, what is Lab 415 or, what is the real, it's going to pull all your content from your site, which is you did for Google. It's going to pull YouTube videos. YouTube's such a huge piece now for search. A lot of marketers like, it doesn't really work for me on paid, but I got to tell you, it works so well organically. And because it comes up, it's being pulled by ChatGPT, and ChatGPT loves to read. And so you really want to take those transcripts that you put under your YouTube videos and summarize them. And then Substack is another piece, like blogging. WordPress is back in vogue. You'll see all those pieces, LinkedIn, X, Pinterest. You'll see all those pieces come into your ChatGPT. And that's really important for brands to start thinking about content strategy. And again, where it actually aligns with growth. Like for the Real, it was authentication in the brand. And like, so how do you make content? Videos are really important that will be consumed by Google and ChatGPT.
Yeah. And that's something that's really interesting. And I've been speaking with people a lot about, because of course, Google has their AI overviews. Some people like them, some people don't, but it's a way for them to still position themselves as the number one place for search, even though we know younger generations are searching on TikTok, right? On YouTube. We know now that you have to have strong brand presence everywhere so that you show up on Chat or Claude or whatever your LLM of choice is. And it's really changing and evolving the way that we think about both organic and spend. And I'm going, okay, now are we going to start seeing ads when we're using our LLMs? Because Google's losing, I think it's 35% of search to these LLMs. So I wanted to talk about, because it seems like these are probably some of the approaches that you take into Lab 415. Even at your time at The Real, you were advising a lot of other organizations. Then you started your own shop and you work with pre-IPO companies. So I want to ask why that space specifically, and knowing that you've been in both the video game, digital space, and the fashion space, and kind of a lot of other places in between. How do you choose who you work with in that space?
Yeah, I think I prefer the pre-IPO market, and it's harder now, I have to say, because a lot of consumer brands are not being invested in by venture capitalists. They're more going the B2B route of AI companies and so forth. But there are quite a few still out there. And the reason why I like the pre-IPO is because they move much faster. And what I find with the post-IPO companies, they don't want to ruffle feathers organizationally. And so they don't want to they're such creatures to process, and they're adverse to change because it creates too many waves internally. And so, but what I like about startups is everybody's like, that sounds good. Let's try it. We can test it. And so, and I think, we talk about The Real with, they had this authority with authentication. I think I sort of bring, 30 years of experience. And so that gives me some authority sort of like, and so it gives me a leg up in terms of, I think this idea will work, that gives it some power. And so like, I'm able to help, and there's less pride, that like everybody wants to win for the company rather than individual promotions, And so I think I see that a lot in startups rather than, everybody's fighting for their fiefdom. People are more about how do we get this company going? Because, I want to get, a lot of startups. The one good thing that what we did at The Real, and Julie was really hard pressed on this. Like she really felt it was important that everybody got stopped in the company, from the person, doing the pick, pack, and ship at the warehouse to, the marketing manager all the way up. Right. And so I think that's really important for a lot of startups to think about getting everybody, engaged, that we're all working towards a goal here. It's not just about, what I see a lot of is today, a lot of people are just so focused on a title and salary. And I got to tell you, it's so much more rewarding if you're working for a company that's growing and you take a pay cut. You know, it's so funny. You know, I always tell people like they're sort of a higher level in marketing. I'm like, it's okay to take a pay cut because guess what? You're going to be more involved. It won't be this company that's sort of like just growing 5%. And eventually it will catch up. It catches up so quick. So like, you know, I took that pay cut at the Real, but eventually I was making much more than my previous jobs, you know? And so I think it's really important, you know, especially for a lot of college grads, people that come out of their MBAs, it's okay to take a lower than expected salary just to get your hands in the business and to make an impact. Because if you're smart, it will totally come through. And people will be like, oh, we need to keep that person or they're going to leave soon. So we hired MBAs, at the Real, and there was one, I shouldn't embarrass her, but she took she could have went to Google and she took a lower salary job at the Real, and like she became so important to us and our growth. She led all of our partnerships with like Gucci and like Stella McCartney and Burberry. She was flying off to Europe to, go visit them and led all of our sustainability efforts. And we'll plug for Allison out there. So she would not have done that at Google. She would have been plugging away and eventually probably laid off, because AI is coming on vogue, So I think people should really consider that when they're, thinking about their next role. Don't be so beholden to that salary or title that you had.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm, in a role right now beyond podcasting and teaching where I took a substantial pay cut to be the executive director of a foundation, but I get to play in all these areas that I really love. I get to bring new things to the table that they wouldn't have anyone advising on, right? Or anybody with that specific skill set. And to me, that's much more important and the money will follow.
Yeah. And it's quality of life and you can't put a price tag on that, right? And I got to tell you, a lot of times people are like, what are going to be my hours at this startup? Am I going to have to work past 5? And I'm like, you know what? You probably will. But the thing is, I love working at the Real. Like it was my passion, and probably for you too. You probably love teaching. You probably love doing the podcasting. It makes your life so much better when you actually love what you do. I mean, it's like, okay, it's not work anymore. I'll work on the weekends because I want to see how the business is doing. And I think that's something, so you could take that 9-to-5 gig that, has probably a little bit higher salary, but it's not going to be as rewarding from your mental standpoint, and like, I'm not telling everybody to not fight for the salary, but I just feel like, there is something more about being able to impact, like for you, it's probably impacting students and things like that. And I loved working with my team and growing them and then being able to be a part of the Real and the growth story that we're able to talk about today. And that, getting to that crowning moment where we're at the NASDAQ ringing the bell is just like, we're all there. And it's just quite a story versus, just plodding along, at a 9-to-5 job.
So one of the questions I have, you've talked about a few strategies, things that people need to look for to anchor their brand, which then marketing follows, whether it's organic or advertising based. And now, of course, we have this whole thing called generative AI, and everybody knows more about AI and ML on top of generative. So we're seeing that if you are researching, right? Because I'm sure Julia had to do research to make sure that she had a product market fit
I
And
wish we
research,
had AI back then.
right. And research was it took a lot longer, could be a lot more expensive. And so now we have this faster pace. So I'd love to hear a little bit about are you incorporating these tools for your clients? And then, how are you continuing to flesh out what strategies to recommend at this point?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you say about that about research, because I remember, so one thing you always have to do, and I don't like to overfocus on competition because sometimes that can distract you because you always have to look ahead. You can't always be looking at your competition, but it's good to be aware, right? And so we always had to do these competitive matrices to understand, what we're competing against in terms of their product offering. So how do we make sure our value proposition differentiates? So, we would put the ThreadUps, the Poshmarks, the Vestiaire, Vaunt back in the day into this matrix, and we would say, "Oh, okay, we're still good," And then if there was somebody that was coming into the luxury space and authenticating, we're concerned, but oftentimes nobody was doing that. People didn't want to do a lot of work there, and there were a lot of companies doing AI to authenticate handbags. And I gotta tell you, I think there's some value there. Like maybe to look at like where our garment is made, like, Burberry doesn't make that in China, and there's some value there, but, really feeling the handbag, the smell, all that kind of stuff is very tactile. And also, especially with jewelry. So we really went heavy into jewelry, and we had probably more gemologists than Tiffany at some point. And that sort of was a cutting edge, but back to AI. So, and, so AI the nice thing that they'll do that competitive matrix for you right away. It's sort of amazing. But with AI today, I think there's a lot of good tools. And I think a lot of marketers get a little lazy today because they're like, I can't win there because of AI. And I hear this a lot on search and AI overviews. And, the funny thing, I read this the other day that with search, AI overviews are 90% of the results, the general searches. But if it's a local search, like a store near me, women's clothing near me, when there's a store, it's only 9%. So it's still very big. AI overviews are good on general, but not on the local. And so there's a big opportunity there. But where AI can really play some help is like I'll play with a few search engine tools that will give you recommendations on how you can rank high, and like they'll say, they'll say your reviews are down, versus competitors. They'll be like, people are above you in your Google business profile that have these categories, and you could actually do better that way. But then also there's other ones that you can put in what page you want to do better on and rank for a certain keyword. And it will actually come back with content they have gone through machine learning, and they say this content will make you rank high based on the algorithm, and it will give you questions that you should be asking, like, about a brand or whatever, because people want to know, about a certain brand, like where is it made? And that's a question that you'll put in. Tell me about this company. How do you authenticate a Louis Vuitton handbag? And so those questions you can pepper into your content, and they will actually give you a lot of the copy. Now, the problem is some of the copy is not that great. It's very...
It's generic. It's the average, right?
You have to make it sound more human, right? And so there's still a big role for copywriters, but I think it gives you a leap forward that you can get started really fast. And then you have the human element where you make it more human. And those kinds of things give people a big leg up in search, and like, to me, like it used to be so painful to do content blogs and things like that. But now it's like, I can rip them out, like in minutes, and I have to do the editing and all that good stuff, but it's so much faster now, but But the value props and the planning and in your audience. Now, AI will help you a little bit on that research, but you still have to go out and do testing and understand it. And, because the funny thing is a lot of things that I would recommend that would work would never be recommended by AI. Like, to me, if there's a lot of folks still doing linear TV and they have money. And so, you should still, look at linear. And, because guess what? CTV, the folks that have money that you may want to buy your more expensive goods, they pay for blocking ads, and so also direct mail is, something that's still, especially for Gen Z don't get a lot of mail. They get bills, but they don't get a lot of mail. And you can really pop into their mailbox by sending them something that pops through. It's, the creative has to be good. And that can come through. When you start using AI to do all your content, it doesn't work. The ads are just I see a lot of video ads and a lot of people use those generic voices on podcast ads and their radio ads. And people have numbed them out in their heads that they don't pay attention. So you still have to have the advertising creativity to pop. And so, a lot of creatives are really down. Oh, I'm not going to be able to make it in my career, but it's going to help them actually do these harder tasks that took forever to get started. And then now they can just jump into it and put their flair onto the creative.
Yeah. Could not agree with you more. So Marc, what are you most looking forward to next with Lab 415 and where you see growth marketing and all these strategies going?
Yeah. So with Lab 415, I'm continually, looking for companies that are really interesting. The AI companies don't really interest. It's funny. Was a lot of investment going on with these AI companies, but the companies that really cut through that I'm very interested in are the ones that are changing, sort of the way humans do things. So Waymo is very interesting, so, if I'm looking to, I'd love to help those guys. Waymo's, they have taken, it's so funny because poor Elon's trying to get an autonomous vehicle. And in LA, San Francisco, Austin, you probably seen a Waymo and it's an amazing experience. It's just this amazing car ride that you there and back. And it's so relaxing. It has mood music. I'd highly recommend it. And I was so amazed at navigating the North Beach hills of San Francisco. I'm like, oh my God. We're going up a hill, we're going down a hill. It was all fine, And so I look at companies not just AI, but they're really changing the way humans do things. That's really interesting to me. And then there's, but there's a lot of AI companies that are just doing that I don't work with that, they're just doing a project within ChatGPT.
Yeah, and exactly.
What's interesting there? And then, on the transportation, it's really interesting on the transportation sector. There's companies, and it will happen nationwide. There's a lot of, bureaucracy and, it's for safety. Waymo can't take me to the airport. And there's last mile trucking companies that are autonomous trucks now that are being used in areas in Nevada and in Texas, which are really interesting. But see, those companies, they just, the Waymo thing, I feel needs the trust equation that a marketer can give. Because we have to make sure, people above 50 are okay with it. That they're going to be safe.
Touche. I'm 50.
I'm 50. But, so we need to make sure marketers have to think about the trust equation with all these AI companies. So I want to help with companies that need that. There's lots of great companies. There's lots of companies that came out of COVID, BetterHelp is a good company. Came out of COVID, the Zoom boom. But I think their big thing, right now is they think people just look for therapists, but people look for therapists near me. And how do you win locally when you're trying to sell a product that you don't have to be in it? You don't have to be close to that therapist. We can do the Zoom and have a therapy session. And so like, guys, you guys need better centers, and so we can bridge that, today's people looking for a therapist near them and the new thing that I can have therapy anywhere. And imagine this, the search and awareness boom you would get by having these better centers like we work for therapy. And so I like to work for companies that they're sort of stuck and they need to get to the next layer and a level. And I often look for companies that are stuck on Google, stuck on Meta, and we can't grow anymore. Like I worked for one company, I don't want to name them, that they were stuck on Google. They've been around forever. And we just started doing all this top of funnel podcasting and TV, and they're doing 40% growth in this economy. So I love to sort of break through with companies like that. And, and so, it's really, I look at a lot of venture funding, see who's getting funded, and sort of if somebody has money, it's still about venture money. You still, hopefully that start to come through again. It's really dried up in the last year or two, but there's still a lot of companies out there that have funding and they need to get to an equity moment. And one thing that's always newness. These companies that just take on the same thing and they don't pivot. And I'm not saying you have to pivot your whole, business model, but you have to keep on thinking about growth. One book that really resonates with me is Phil Knight's Shoe Dog, Nike. His big thing was grow or die. And, Elon took it to a whole different level. And that's another good book you should read is the Elon's biography that just came out. But, you have to keep on thinking about the next thing. And I love helping CEOs think about that. And so, I get really involved in the product and the marketing. So if we're just talking about the marketing, I'm like, okay, but it's to evolve too, and so if you're doing the same thing over and over, it doesn't matter how many times you say it a different way, you have to evolve the product. And like, that's a key thing. Like, I gotta tell you, everybody thinks, Tesla's, dead in the water right now. And, you can say what you want about him, but if he does autonomous vehicles and they're safe, people are going to buy his products again. Oh, it's always about evolution of your brand. You got to stay true to your value propositions. And I think you have to nail that early, and sort of expand it, But I like to help CEOs that need that, but they're sort of stuck. And, they're sort of, oftentimes they're like, oh, we fired the whole marketing team. And it's not always about the marketing, it's a mixture of product and marketing.
Yeah. We will, of course, have the link to Lab 415 in the show notes and to your LinkedIn for everybody. I always like to ask my guests one last question, which is, do you have a favorite quote, mantra, words of wisdom that help keep you inspired to live in this space every day?
Well, not to be corny or anything, but, I've always felt you must cultivate your gardens, which is a Voltaire aid reference, that you always have to keep growing and, sort of learning. And that's the garden part, right? So sowing those seeds, making sure that you're growing, making those, cultivate your garden beds. And, so for now, today's marketer it's AI. You have to learn about AI and how you can actually use it to do your job.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, Marc, I know this is just like a short snippet of what we could have talked about, but you gave some really good actionable advice to everybody. And it was really fun having this conversation. The first of many, I hope.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody who's watching this episode or listening to it on your favorite platform. Don't forget to leave us a rating and review. Let us know what you liked. And if you are in that place where you need a product and marketing expert to come to your aid, we have one right here for you. With that, I'll be back with another amazing guest to share their story, their journey, and some tips and tricks for you very shortly. Thanks for listening or watching to this episode of Your Brand Amplified. Don't forget to leave us a rating or review on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you want to learn more, check us out at yourbrandamplified.com.